My name is Amanda Stone. I'm 29 years old, and I just endured the most humiliating family dinner of my life when my mother screamed, "You'll never be like your sister," while my sister Vanessa nodded smugly in agreement, both completely unaware that I had secretly cleared my mother's $42,000 credit card debt crisis just 3 months earlier. What they didn't know was that their comparison between the selfish daughter and the generous one was about to be shattered when I revealed exactly who had been preventing our family's complete financial destruction. I've spent the last 6 years building a successful tax consulting practice in Denver, specializing in helping small businesses navigate complex financial situations and avoid the kind of debt traps that destroy families. The irony wasn't lost on me that while I spent my days helping strangers escape financial ruin, my own mother was drowning in credit card debt that she was desperately trying to hide from everyone in our family. My relationship with my mother, Patricia, has always been complicated by her obvious favoritism toward my older sister, Vanessa, who at 32 has built what appears to be a successful lifestyle blogging career around wellness, family values, and authentic living. While I chose the practical path of accounting and finance, Vanessa chose the glamorous world of social media influence, and my mother has never let me forget which choice she considers more admirable. "Amanda, you're so focused on money and numbers," my mother would say whenever I tried to give her practical financial advice. "Vanessa understands that life is about more than just being successful in business. She knows how to care about people and put family first." The constant comparisons had been painful throughout my 20s, but I had learned to accept that in my mother's eyes, I would always be the daughter who was too practical, too serious, and too focused on financial security. The pattern had been consistent for years. Vanessa would visit our mother with expensive gifts, elaborate dinner plans, and social media-worthy experiences that she would document extensively for her blog and Instagram account. Meanwhile, I would quietly handle the practical aspects of family life, helping with tax preparations, insurance questions, and financial planning that my mother found boring but necessary. But what my mother and Vanessa didn't know was that I had been monitoring my mother's financial situation for months, watching with growing alarm as her credit card balances climbed higher and her minimum payments consumed larger portions of her fixed retirement income. Have you ever watched someone you love make financial decisions that you knew would destroy them, while being told that your concern was just cold calculation rather than genuine care? The breaking point came 3 months ago when I discovered that my mother was facing complete financial collapse. Through my professional network, I learned that collection agencies were preparing to pursue legal action against her, and that she was on the verge of losing her home due to her inability to manage the debt payments that had spiraled completely out of control. Without telling anyone in my family, I liquidated a significant portion of my business savings account and personally paid off all $42,000 of my mother's outstanding credit card debt. I negotiated directly with the credit card companies, settled accounts that were in collections, and ensured that her credit score would recover rather than being permanently destroyed by bankruptcy proceedings. The process had taken weeks of phone calls, paperwork, and careful financial maneuvering to ensure that my mother's debt crisis was resolved without creating additional tax implications or legal complications. I had done all of this quietly, without seeking recognition or gratitude, simply because I couldn't bear to watch my mother lose everything she had worked to build. But tonight's family dinner would reveal that my mother and Vanessa had constructed a completely different narrative about family generosity and caring, one that painted me as the selfish daughter who cared more about money than family, while elevating Vanessa as the epitome of love and support despite her complete ignorance of our family's real financial situation. The dinner that would change everything started like dozens of others I had attended over the years, with my mother praising Vanessa's latest blog posts about family values, while treating my actual financial contributions to the family as evidence of my cold, calculating nature. But this time, their comparison between the generous daughter and the selfish one was about to be exposed as a complete fabrication built on assumptions rather than reality. The family gathering had been planned to celebrate Vanessa's latest milestone, reaching 100,000 followers on Instagram with her lifestyle blog that focused on authentic family relationships and the importance of putting loved ones first. My mother had invited extended family members to witness what she clearly considered Vanessa's triumph, and the evening had been designed to showcase her favorite daughter's success and caring nature. "Vanessa has always understood what really matters in life," my mother announced to the assembled relatives as we sat down for dinner. "She knows that family comes before money, that relationships are more important than business success. She's the kind of daughter who puts her heart before her bank account." The praise was particularly painful because I knew exactly how much my mother's financial security depended on my bank account rather than Vanessa's heart. For the past 3 months, my mother had been living debt-free because of the $42,000 I had quietly spent to rescue her from bankruptcy. But she was attributing her improved financial situation to better budgeting rather than understanding the massive intervention that had saved her. Vanessa was glowing under the attention, sharing stories about her latest blog posts that featured our mother and discussing her philosophy about authentic caring versus superficial success. She had brought expensive flowers, a custom photo book of family memories, and a designer handbag as gifts for our mother, all of which would be featured in her upcoming blog post about showing love through thoughtful gestures. "Amanda works so hard at her business," Vanessa said with what appeared to be sisterly pride, but felt like condescension. "But sometimes I worry that she's missing out on the emotional side of family relationships. Success is wonderful, but it can't replace the deep connections that come from really caring about each other." The irony of being lectured about caring by someone who had no idea that I had prevented our mother's financial ruin was almost overwhelming. But I had learned over the years to stay quiet during these family celebrations of Vanessa's superior emotional intelligence and generosity. My mother nodded enthusiastically at Vanessa's assessment of my priorities. "Amanda has always been so focused on money and business," she said, her voice carrying the familiar tone of disappointment that I had heard throughout my adult life. "She's successful, but she doesn't understand that family is about more than just financial planning and tax advice." The conversation continued with various relatives praising Vanessa's approach to family relationships while treating my practical contributions as evidence of emotional deficiency. My Aunt Carol mentioned how wonderful it was to see a young woman who prioritized family over career advancement, while my Uncle Robert commented on how refreshing it was to meet someone who understood that love was more important than money. Have you ever sat through a conversation where people praised someone else for qualities that you were actually demonstrating, while criticizing you for lacking those same qualities? That's exactly what I experienced as my family celebrated Vanessa's theoretical generosity, while remaining completely ignorant of my actual financial sacrifice for our mother's security. The turning point came when my mother started discussing her recent financial improvements with obvious pride and relief. "I've been doing so much better with my budget lately," she announced to the table. "I've managed to pay off some old debts and get my finances back on track. It feels wonderful to have that weight off my shoulders." I watched my mother take credit for financial improvements that had actually resulted from my $42,000 intervention, while Vanessa nodded approvingly as if her emotional support had somehow contributed to this remarkable turnaround in our mother's debt situation. "That's wonderful, Mom," Vanessa said warmly. "I'm so proud of you for taking control of your financial situation. It shows that when you have the right support and encouragement from people who really care about you, you can overcome any challenge." The implication that my mother's financial recovery had resulted from Vanessa's emotional support rather than my actual financial intervention was too much for me to bear silently. I could feel my frustration building as I listened to my family attribute a miracle of debt resolution to budgeting discipline rather than understanding the massive monetary rescue that had actually occurred. "Vanessa has been such a support to me during this difficult time," my mother continued, reaching over to squeeze my sister's hand. "She understands that sometimes people need emotional encouragement rather than just practical advice. She knows how to really be there for family when they need her most." The conversation had reached the point where my mother was explicitly contrasting Vanessa's supposed emotional support with my practical approach, completely unaware that my practical approach had literally saved her from bankruptcy, while Vanessa's emotional support had contributed nothing to resolving her actual financial crisis. I realized that staying silent was no longer an option. My family had constructed a narrative about generosity and caring that was completely divorced from reality, and they were using that false narrative to judge my character and value as a daughter. The time had come to reveal the truth about who had actually been providing the support that prevented our family's financial destruction. The moment of truth arrived when my mother decided to use me as a negative example while praising Vanessa's superior approach to family relationships. She had been drinking wine throughout dinner, and her inhibitions were lower than usual, which led to her being more direct about her disappointment in my priorities and character. "You know what I love about Vanessa?" my mother said, looking directly at me with an expression that mixed affection for my sister with clear criticism of my choices. "She understands that being successful isn't enough if you're not willing to put family first. She knows that sometimes the people you love need more than just practical advice. They need real caring and emotional support." The statement was clearly directed at me, and everyone at the table understood that my mother was drawing an unfavorable comparison between my approach to family relationships and Vanessa's supposedly superior emotional intelligence and generosity. "Amanda is good at her job," my mother continued, "but she's never learned how to really be there for family when they need her most. She thinks everything can be solved with spreadsheets and financial planning, but she doesn't understand that sometimes people need love and encouragement rather than lectures about money management." The characterization of my concern about her financial situation as lectures about money management was particularly painful, especially since those lectures had been motivated by my growing awareness that she was heading toward financial disaster that would destroy her retirement security and force her to depend on family support for basic survival. Vanessa was nodding along with my mother's assessment, clearly enjoying the praise while remaining oblivious to the fact that her emotional support had contributed nothing to solving the actual financial crisis that our mother had been facing. "I think some people are just naturally more caring and generous," Vanessa said, her voice carrying the tone of someone who considered herself an expert on family relationships. "It's not about money or success. It's about having the emotional intelligence to understand what people really need from their family members." The lecture about emotional intelligence from someone who had completely missed our mother's financial crisis was infuriating, but what happened next pushed me beyond my breaking point. My mother, emboldened by the wine and the supportive audience, decided to make her criticism of me even more explicit and painful. "You know what frustrates me most about Amanda?" she said, her voice rising with emotion. "She has all this success and money, but she's never learned to be generous with her family. She's always calculating and careful, always worried about her own financial security rather than thinking about how she could help the people she supposedly loves." The accusation that I wasn't generous with my family hit me like a physical blow, especially since I had spent $42,000 of my own money just 3 months earlier to prevent her financial ruin. But my mother wasn't finished with her assessment of my character flaws. "Vanessa understands what family means," she continued, her voice becoming more emotional and accusatory. "She knows that when someone you love is struggling, you don't give them lectures about budgeting. You give them support and encouragement, and help them feel less alone. She knows how to actually care about people instead of just analyzing their problems." Have you ever been accused of not caring about someone while you were sitting on evidence that you had made enormous personal sacrifices for their welfare? That's exactly what I experienced as my mother criticized my supposed lack of generosity while remaining completely unaware of the financial rescue I had provided. "Amanda will never be like Vanessa," my mother said finally, her voice filled with disappointment and resignation. "She'll never understand that success means nothing if you're not willing to sacrifice for the people you love. She'll always be too focused on her own security to really put family first." The statement that I would never be like Vanessa in terms of family sacrifice was the final straw. My mother had just accused me of being unwilling to sacrifice for family while I was sitting at her table having spent more than half of my business savings to prevent her bankruptcy 3 months earlier. Vanessa was nodding smugly at this assessment, clearly satisfied with the comparison that elevated her as the caring, generous daughter while painting me as selfish and calculating. She had no idea that her supposed superiority in family caring was about to be exposed as a complete fabrication. I stood up from the table slowly, feeling the weight of 3 months of silence about my financial intervention and years of unfavorable comparisons to my sister's theoretical generosity. The time had come to reveal the truth about who had actually been sacrificing for our family's welfare. The room fell silent as I stood, sensing that something significant was about to happen. My mother looked up at me with surprise, clearly not expecting me to respond to her criticism in any dramatic way. "Since I'll never be like Vanessa," I said, my voice calm and controlled despite the anger I was feeling. "Let me ask her a question that might interest everyone at this table." I reached into my purse and pulled out the folder of financial documents that I had been carrying for months, waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth about our family's real financial situation and my role in resolving it. "Vanessa," I said, looking directly at my sister, "since you're such an expert on family caring and generosity, maybe you can tell everyone at this table who cleared Mom's credit cards, all $42,000 of them." The question hung in the air like a bomb that hadn't yet exploded, but everyone could sense that something fundamental was about to change in our family dynamics. The silence that followed my question was unlike anything I had ever experienced at a family gathering. You could have heard a pin drop as every person at the table processed what I had just said and began to understand that there was information about our family's financial situation that they had never been told. My mother's face went white as she realized that I knew about her debt crisis, and that I was apparently claiming to have resolved it through some kind of intervention that she didn't remember or understand. Vanessa looked confused and caught off guard, clearly having no idea what I was talking about, but sensing that her position as the family's generous daughter was about to be challenged in a way she hadn't anticipated. "I don't understand the question," Vanessa said, her voice uncertain for the first time all evening. "What credit cards? What are you talking about, Amanda?" I opened the folder and spread the financial documents across the dinner table, showing bank statements, debt settlement agreements, and payment confirmations that told the complete story of my mother's financial crisis and my intervention to resolve it. "I'm talking about the $42,000 in credit card debt that was about to destroy Mom's retirement and force her into bankruptcy," I said, my voice becoming stronger as I finally had the opportunity to reveal the truth. "I'm talking about the collection agencies that were preparing legal action against her. I'm talking about the financial intervention that saved our family from complete economic disaster." The documents spread across the table painted a clear picture of financial crisis and resolution that no one in my family had been aware of except for me. Bank statements showed massive debt payments, settlement agreements revealed negotiations with collection agencies, and payment confirmations documented the systematic elimination of crushing debt that had threatened our mother's basic security. "Amanda," my mother whispered, her voice filled with shock and growing realization. "What is all this? What are these papers? These papers show that 3 months ago, you were facing complete financial ruin," I said, pulling out specific documents to illustrate each point. "You had $42,000 in credit card debt across 7 different cards. You were making minimum payments that barely covered the interest charges. Collection agencies were preparing to pursue legal action for unpaid balances." The revelation of the extent of my mother's financial crisis was clearly news to everyone at the table, including Vanessa, who was staring at the documents with growing comprehension of how serious the situation had been. "This document," I continued, holding up a settlement agreement, "shows that I negotiated directly with Capital One to settle a $14,000 balance for $8,000 paid in full. This one shows that I paid off a $12,000 Chase card that was 3 months past due. This one shows that I settled a $9,000 Discover card that was already in collections. Have you ever watched someone's entire understanding of their family situation change in real time as they learned information that completely altered their perception of reality? That's exactly what was happening as my relatives began to understand that our family's financial stability had been hanging by a thread just 3 months earlier. "I liquidated $42,000 from my business savings account," I said, pulling out bank statements that showed the massive withdrawals I had made to fund the debt resolution. "I spent weeks negotiating with credit card companies and collection agencies to ensure that Mom's credit score could recover rather than being permanently destroyed by bankruptcy." My mother was staring at the documents with tears in her eyes, clearly realizing for the first time that her improved financial situation hadn't resulted from better budgeting, but from a massive financial intervention that had saved her from economic disaster. "Amanda," she said, her voice breaking, "you did all this? You paid off all my debt? When? How? Why didn't you tell me?" "I did it because I couldn't bear to watch you lose everything you had worked to build," I replied. "I did it because I knew that bankruptcy would destroy your retirement security and force you to depend on family support for basic survival. I did it because despite your disappointment in my character, I actually do care about your welfare more than my own financial security." The contrast between my actual financial sacrifice and Vanessa's theoretical emotional support was becoming impossible to ignore. While my sister had been posting Instagram photos about family values, I had been quietly spending my business savings to prevent our mother's financial ruin. "But why didn't you tell me?" my mother asked, clearly struggling to understand why I had kept such a significant intervention secret. "Why did you let me think I had managed to improve my finances on my own?" "Because you were so proud of your progress," I said. "Because you were finally feeling hopeful about your financial situation instead of stressed and overwhelmed. Because I knew that learning you had needed such a massive rescue would be humiliating for someone who values her independence as much as you do." The explanation of my motivation for keeping the intervention secret seemed to hit my mother particularly hard, as she realized that my decision to remain silent had been motivated by consideration for her emotional welfare, rather than a desire for recognition or gratitude. Vanessa was looking increasingly uncomfortable as she began to understand that her status as the family's generous daughter was built on complete ignorance of the actual financial support that had been provided by her supposedly selfish sister. "I don't understand," Vanessa said, her voice defensive. "If this is true, why are you bringing it up now? Why are you telling everyone about this at a family dinner?" I looked directly at my sister, remembering all the years of unfavorable comparisons and all the evening's lectures about emotional intelligence and family caring. "I'm bringing it up now because I just spent an entire evening listening to lectures about how I'll never be like you in terms of family sacrifice and generosity," I said. "I'm bringing it up because I've been criticized for caring more about money than family, while sitting on evidence that I spent $42,000 to prevent our mother's financial ruin." The room fell silent again, as everyone processed the magnitude of what I had revealed and began to understand how wrong their assumptions about my character and priorities had been. The impact of my revelation rippled through the family gathering like an earthquake, fundamentally altering everyone's understanding of family dynamics, financial realities, and the true meaning of generosity and sacrifice. The contrast between perception and reality was so stark that several relatives were visibly struggling to process the information I had just shared. My Aunt Carol, who had praised Vanessa's emotional intelligence just an hour earlier, was staring at the financial documents with obvious shock. "Amanda," she said quietly, "you paid off $42,000 of debt. You saved your mother from bankruptcy. When did this happen?" "3 months ago," I replied, organizing the documents to show the timeline of crisis and intervention. Mom was facing legal action from multiple creditors. Her minimum payments were consuming more than half of her retirement income, and she was borrowing from new credit cards to make payments on existing ones. The situation was unsustainable and heading toward complete financial collapse. The description of my mother's financial crisis was clearly news to most of the family members present, who had no idea how serious her situation had become or how close she had come to losing everything she had worked to build. My Uncle Robert, who had commented earlier about Vanessa's refreshing focus on love over money, was now looking at my sister with a different expression. "Vanessa," he said, "did you know about your mother's debt situation? Did you know how serious her financial problems had become?" Vanessa's face flushed as she realized that her ignorance of our mother's real situation was being exposed in front of the entire family. "I knew Mom was stressed about money sometimes," she said defensively, "but I didn't know it was that serious. She never told me she was in that much debt. She never told you because you never asked the practical questions," I said, not unkindly, but directly. "When you visited, you focused on emotional support and social media content. When I visited, I asked about her budget, her bills, her credit card balances. That's why I knew she was in crisis. And you didn't." The distinction between emotional support and practical awareness was becoming clear to everyone at the table. Vanessa had been providing the kind of help that made both her and our mother feel good, while I had been providing the kind of help that actually solved problems and prevented disasters. My mother was crying now, not from sadness, but from a mixture of gratitude, embarrassment, and realization about how wrong she had been about my character and priorities. "Amanda," she said through her tears, "I had no idea you were watching my finances so carefully. I had no idea you cared enough to intervene when things got that bad." "Mom," I said gently, "I've been monitoring your financial situation for years, not because I'm controlling or obsessed with money, but because I know how devastating financial ruin can be for someone your age. I was prepared to help because I could see the warning signs that everyone else was missing." Have you ever had a moment when someone finally understood that your practical concern was actually a deeper form of love than their emotional gestures? That's exactly what was happening, as my mother began to realize that my focus on financial planning had been motivated by genuine care for her security and independence. "I feel so stupid," my mother said, looking at the documents that showed the extent of her crisis and my intervention. "I was so proud of myself for improving my financial situation, and all along it was because you had quietly saved me from disaster. I was taking credit for your sacrifice." The realization that her financial improvement had resulted from my intervention rather than her budgeting discipline was clearly difficult for my mother to accept, but it was also helping her understand why I had been so focused on practical financial matters rather than emotional support. Vanessa was becoming increasingly uncomfortable as the conversation continued to highlight the contrast between her surface-level emotional support and my substantial financial intervention. "I still think emotional support is important," she said, though her voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier in the evening. "Emotional support is important," I agreed, "but it doesn't pay off credit card debt or prevent bankruptcy. It doesn't negotiate with collection agencies or save someone's credit score from permanent damage. Emotional support is wonderful, but it doesn't solve financial crises." The distinction was harsh but necessary. Vanessa had been taking credit for superior family caring while remaining completely ignorant of the practical problems that were threatening our mother's basic security. My cousin Lisa, who had listened to the entire conversation in stunned silence, finally spoke up. "Vanessa," she said, "you've been writing blog posts about family values and authentic caring, but Amanda actually prevented a family financial disaster. How do you reconcile those two things?" The question forced Vanessa to confront the gap between her public persona as a caring family member and her actual ignorance of our family's real needs and challenges. "I didn't know how serious the situation was," Vanessa said, her voice becoming more defensive. "If I had known, I would have helped. I care about Mom just as much as Amanda does. But you didn't know because you didn't ask the hard questions," I said. "You focused on the kind of support that felt good to give and receive, while I focused on the kind of support that actually solved problems. We both care about Mom, but we showed it in very different ways." The conversation was helping everyone understand that there are different types of caring, and that practical intervention can be a more profound expression of love than emotional gestures, even though it's less visible and less appreciated. My mother looked up at me with an expression I had never seen before, genuine appreciation mixed with regret about her previous judgments of my character and priorities. "Amanda," she said, "I owe you an enormous apology. I've been criticizing you for being too focused on money when you were actually using that focus to protect my financial security. I've been so wrong about what your concern really meant." The apology was meaningful, but what was more important was that my mother was finally understanding that my practical approach to family relationships had been motivated by genuine love rather than cold calculation. The family dinner that had started as a celebration of Vanessa's superior emotional intelligence had become a revelation about the difference between surface caring and substantial sacrifice, between public gestures and private interventions, between talking about family values and actually protecting family welfare. As the evening wound down and relatives began to process what they had learned, it became clear that fundamental assumptions about our family dynamics would never be the same again. The days following my revelation at the family dinner brought a cascade of changes in how my relatives understood family relationships, financial responsibility, and the true meaning of generosity and caring. The contrast between Vanessa's public persona and my private sacrifice had created ripples throughout our extended family that would permanently alter their perceptions of both my sister and me. My mother called me the morning after the dinner, her voice heavy with emotion and regret. "Amanda," she said, "I couldn't sleep last night thinking about everything you revealed. I kept going over all the conversations we've had about money and responsibility, and I realize now how unfairly I've been treating you." The acknowledgement of unfair treatment was something I had hoped for, but never expected to receive. My mother had spent years comparing me unfavorably to Vanessa, without understanding the practical reality of how our different approaches to family support actually played out in terms of real-world impact. "I was so focused on what I thought caring should look like," my mother continued, "that I completely missed what caring actually looked like in your actions. I was praising Vanessa for bringing flowers and posting photos while you were quietly preventing my financial ruin. I feel ashamed of how blind I was." The conversation continued for over an hour, with my mother expressing genuine remorse for her years of favoritism and her failure to recognize the depth of my concern for her welfare. But more importantly, she was beginning to understand that her financial stability had been dependent on my practical intervention, rather than Vanessa's emotional support. "I want you to know that I'm going to pay you back," my mother said, though her voice suggested she understood that the amount involved was beyond her ability to repay quickly. "I can't let you carry that financial burden alone when it was my irresponsibility that created the problem in the first place." "Mom," I said, "I didn't pay off your debt because I expected to be repaid. I did it because I couldn't bear to watch you lose everything you had worked to build. The money was a gift, not a loan." The distinction between a gift and a loan was important because it helped my mother understand that my intervention had been motivated by love rather than a desire to create financial obligation or control over her decisions. But the most significant change was in how my mother was beginning to talk about Vanessa's role in our family dynamics. For the first time in my memory, she was questioning whether surface-level emotional support was really superior to practical financial intervention. "I've been thinking about all the times Vanessa visited, and we talked about my financial stress," my mother said. She would listen and offer encouragement, but she never asked specific questions about my debt or suggested practical solutions. I thought that meant she was more emotionally intelligent, but now I wonder if it just meant she was avoiding the difficult conversations. Have you ever watched someone realize that they had been rewarding style over substance, appearance over reality? That's exactly what was happening as my mother began to understand that Vanessa's approach to family support had been designed to feel good rather than to solve actual problems. Meanwhile, Vanessa was struggling with the complete collapse of her status as the family's more caring and generous daughter. The revelation that I had spent $42,000 to prevent our mother's bankruptcy while she had remained ignorant of the crisis had undermined her entire identity as someone who put family first. "Amanda," Vanessa called me 3 days after the dinner, her voice subdued and uncertain. "I've been thinking about what happened at dinner, and I want you to know that I feel terrible about not knowing how serious Mom's situation was. I should have been paying closer attention to her practical needs instead of just focusing on emotional support." The acknowledgement of her oversight was encouraging, but I could tell that Vanessa was also struggling with the implications of what my revelation meant for her public persona as a family-focused lifestyle blogger. "I don't know how to reconcile the fact that I've been writing about family values and authentic caring while you were actually preventing a family disaster," Vanessa continued. "I feel like a fraud. I've been taking credit for superior emotional intelligence while you were demonstrating superior practical love." The crisis in Vanessa's self-perception was understandable. Her entire brand had been built around the idea that she understood family relationships better than people who were focused on practical concerns like financial planning and business success. "Vanessa," I said, "emotional support is valuable and important. You weren't wrong to provide that. The problem was assuming that emotional support was superior to practical intervention, and that my focus on financial matters meant I cared less about family than you did." The conversation helped Vanessa understand that the issue wasn't her approach to family support, But her dismissive attitude toward my different approach and her assumption that style was more important than substance. But the most challenging aspect of the situation for Vanessa was figuring out how to address the disconnect between her public persona and the reality of our family dynamics. Her blog and social media presence had been built around positioning herself as someone who understood authentic family caring better than people who were focused on material success. "I don't know what to do about my blog," Vanessa admitted. "I've written dozens of posts about putting family first and understanding what really matters, but it turns out I was completely ignorant of what our family really needed. How do I continue writing about family values when I've been exposed as someone who talks about caring more than actually caring?" The question was profound and went to the heart of the difference between performing family values and actually living them. Vanessa had built her career around appearing to be a caring family member, while I had been quietly demonstrating actual care through substantial financial sacrifice. "Maybe you could write about what you've learned," I suggested. "Maybe you could explore the difference between emotional support and practical intervention, and help your readers understand that there are different ways to show love for family members." The suggestion seemed to intrigue Vanessa, who was clearly looking for a way to maintain her career while acknowledging the gap between her previous assumptions and the reality of effective family support. Over the next few weeks, the impact of my revelation continued to spread through our extended family, as relatives processed what they had learned about financial crisis, practical intervention, and the difference between visible and invisible forms of family support. My Aunt Carol called to apologize for her previous assumptions about my character and priorities. "Amanda," she said, "I realize now that I was judging you based on superficial observations rather than understanding what you were actually contributing to the family. Your quiet sacrifice was more meaningful than all of Vanessa's public gestures combined." Similar calls came from other relatives who had witnessed the dinner revelation and were reconsidering their previous judgments about family relationships, financial responsibility, and the true meaning of generosity and caring. But the most meaningful change was in my relationship with my mother, who was finally beginning to appreciate the depth of my concern for her welfare and the extent of my willingness to sacrifice for her security. "Amanda," she said during one of our weekly phone calls, "I want you to know that I understand now that your focus on practical matters was actually a deeper form of love than I realized. You were protecting me from disaster while I was criticizing you for being too concerned about money." The recognition of my practical love was something I had hoped for throughout my adult life, but had never expected to receive. My mother was finally understanding that financial planning and business success could be expressions of family caring rather than evidence of emotional deficiency. 6 months after the family dinner revelation, the changes in our family dynamics had stabilized into a new normal that was based on mutual respect rather than unfair comparisons and false assumptions about caring and generosity. My mother had made significant progress in understanding personal finance and was working with me to develop sustainable budgeting practices that would prevent future debt crises. She was also consistently expressing appreciation for my practical approach to family support, rather than criticizing it as evidence of emotional coldness. "I never want to be in that kind of financial situation again," my mother told me during one of our monthly budget reviews. "I want to learn how to manage money the way you do, so that I can maintain my independence without requiring rescue from family members." The commitment to financial literacy was encouraging because it showed that my mother was taking responsibility for her previous poor decisions, while also recognizing the value of the practical skills that had allowed me to intervene when she needed help. Vanessa had undergone her own transformation, both personally and professionally. She had written a series of blog posts about learning to recognize different forms of family support and had shifted her content focus from positioning herself as an expert on family relationships to exploring the complexities and challenges of authentic caring. I realized that I had confused performing family values with actually living them, Vanessa wrote in one of her most popular posts. "I thought that bringing flowers and posting photos made me a better family member than my sister who was quietly handling practical financial matters. I was wrong about what caring really looks like." The shift in Vanessa's content had actually increased her audience engagement, as readers responded to her honesty about learning and growth. rather than her previous claims of superior emotional intelligence. But the most significant change was in my own sense of family belonging and recognition. For the first time in my adult life, I felt valued for who I actually was rather than criticized for who I wasn't. My practical approach to family relationships was finally being recognized as a legitimate and valuable form of caring. Have you ever experienced the relief of finally being understood and appreciated by people whose opinion matters to you? That's exactly what I felt as my family's assumptions about generosity, caring, and family sacrifice were replaced by a more accurate understanding of how different people contribute to family welfare in different ways. The $42,000 I had spent to prevent my mother's bankruptcy had been worth every penny, not because it solved her immediate financial crisis, but because it ultimately led to a family dynamic based on mutual respect and accurate understanding rather than false comparisons and unfair judgments. During a recent family gathering, a much smaller and more intimate affair than the dinner where I had made my revelation, my mother stood up to make a toast that captured the essence of what our family had learned through this experience. "I want to toast Amanda," my mother said, raising her glass and looking directly at me. "I spent years comparing her unfavorably to her sister, thinking that Vanessa's emotional support was superior to Amanda's practical intervention. I was wrong. Amanda's willingness to sacrifice her own financial security to protect my independence was the deepest form of love I could have received." The toast was followed by genuine applause from relatives who had witnessed our family's journey from false assumptions to accurate understanding about the nature of caring and sacrifice. I also want to acknowledge that different people show love in different ways, my mother continued. Vanessa's emotional support was valuable and meaningful, but Amanda's practical intervention was literally life-saving. I needed both types of caring, but I failed to recognize and appreciate the one that actually solved my problems. The recognition that both emotional and practical support had value, while acknowledging that practical intervention had been more crucial during the crisis, represented a mature and balanced understanding of family relationships that my mother had never demonstrated before. As the evening concluded and I prepared to drive home, I reflected on the journey that had brought our family from dysfunction to health, from false assumptions to accurate understanding, from unfair comparisons to mutual respect. The woman who had been told she would never be like her sister in terms of family caring had proven that authentic generosity looks different from performative caring, that practical love is often more valuable than emotional gestures, and that true family support sometimes requires substantial personal sacrifice rather than just social media-worthy moments. The most important lesson I learned was that protecting your own financial security isn't incompatible with family generosity. Sometimes the most generous thing you can do is use your financial stability to prevent someone you love from losing theirs. The practical skills that my family had criticized as evidence of emotional deficiency had actually enabled the most significant act of family caring in our recent history. If you're reading this and you've been criticized for being too practical or too focused on financial matters, while family members praise others for more visible forms of caring, please know that your practical concern might be the most valuable gift you can offer. Sometimes the people who dismiss your contributions are the ones who benefit most from them. The family relationships I have today are built on accurate understanding rather than false assumptions, on mutual respect rather than unfair comparisons, on recognition of different forms of caring, rather than privileging style over substance. It took courage to reveal the truth about my financial sacrifice, but it was worth every difficult conversation and painful realization. If this story resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and share your experiences in the comments below. Have you ever been undervalued by family members who didn't understand the depth of your practical support? How did you handle situations where others received credit for caring, while your actual sacrifices went unrecognized? Your story might help someone else who's struggling with similar family dynamics. Thank you for joining me on this journey. And remember that authentic caring comes in many forms, and practical love is just as valuable as emotional support. See you in our next story here on Her Sweet Revenge.